This is the podcast Byzantium and Friends. Welcome back, everyone. I am Anthony, your host. I want to take you back to the 14th century, which was a generally calamitous time, and not only because of the Black Death. In the Balkans, most states were falling apart, fairly quickly, and the rising Ottoman Empire hadn't yet solidified its control such that it could provide a framework for stability for people. So this was a very turbulent, unsettled time. There's a remarkable attestation in the historians of that period that the Orthodox states in the Balkans had agreed not to take each other's subjects as captives. So this is Bulgaria, the Romans, the Serbs. This was a remarkable statement when I came across it, in part because at almost no other point in their history had these Orthodox states decided to cooperate on any matter such as that. Remember, despite talk of a Byzantine Commonwealth and things like that, that's largely a modern idea. These states and peoples at the time did not ever form these kinds of alliances, federations, nor did they have a sense that their states should behave differently because they happened to be aligned in the same religious tradition. But in this particular case, it seems to have made a difference to them in a context of very general raiding, taking captives, enslaving other people, or selling them into slave markets that emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean specifically. These states had agreed not to do that, at least to each other, which indicates that religion was a kind of deciding factor in who is enslaved by whom and who not. And at the same time, from the same period, I found these remarkable texts, which are basically collection efforts to raise funds to ransom other Romans in other territories, even from different states. In other words, Greek-speaking Orthodox Romans on Crete will take up a collection to raise money to free other fellow ethnic Romans, even if they came from other states. And it's in this context, actually, that they refer very few times, but they do refer to Romans from the free states, like Nicaea, as Romaniotes. So they're all Romai, but these were Romaniotes, were the ones from states that were governed by Romans. And it seems that the state boundaries weren't that important. Orthodox Romans were interested in freeing their own people, which is another remarkable feature of this very fractured period. Now, if you're wondering about these phenomena of raiding and captivity, I will refer you way back to episode 46, which is almost 100 episodes ago, with Alex Sarandis on the economies and practices of raiding in earlier periods, mostly. But there were times when East Roman society was subject to extraordinary stress from those pressures, whether it be from specific rulers such as Attila or specific people such as sort of the Slavs in the 6th century, just raiding across the Danube, carting away thousands, tens of thousands, according to our sources, hundreds of thousands of people. Certainly afterwards with the Arab Caliphate, either raiding overland into Asia Minor and taking away large numbers of peoples and livestock, then by sea into the Aegean. One of the major preoccupations of the Roman state was to tamp that down, to limit the ability of other people to take away its own subjects, literally physically remove the population. And you can view this cynically as the state safeguarding its own economic resources. These are the taxpayers. These are the people who are responsible for primary economic production. I don't see it purely cynically. I think that the Roman state had a very explicitly formulated ideology of protecting the welfare of its own subjects, and this was part of the core relationship between subjects and rulers in this society. It was an expectation, it was reciprocal. And to this degree, one of the major achievements in the entire history of the East Roman state was its ability, its success in ultimately protecting Asia Minor and the Aegean from those kinds of attacks, moving from the period of raiding in the 7th and 8th centuries into a period of stability of greater stability in the 9th, 10th, and early 11th century. That was like really one of its most successful achievements, which very few medieval states ever managed to pull off, literally to protect its population from those kinds of attacks. Now, in the later period, this, of course, completely breaks down, as do most states in this region. And in the chaos that ensues after the 12th century, this was an experience that unfortunately many people were exposed to, they're subject to, just being captured, carted away for one of two reasons: either to be ransomed back to their own people, so for a form of extortion, for which funds needed to be generated, which required institutions, or just to be taken away and disappear into the slave markets, or to be resettled agriculturally or somewhere else to practice whatever craft they knew for the benefit of new masters. And this kind of insecurity was really one of the most defining features of life in this period, in this part of the world. And it is difficult to study because many of the sources are scattered across many different archives, in particular Italian ones, Venetian and Genoese, because they were very active in the region, and so their sources provide insight into what was going on. But they were also very active in the business of taking captives and the slave markets, and so they have left very, very many records about that, which document also the Ottomans' involvement in it. The Ottoman army was, in addition to a force for conquest, it was basically a kind of slave trader at large. And my guest today, Alasdair Grant, has written precisely that book that I was looking for. In fact, seeing as I have been writing a book on 1453, which produced a very large number of captives at the end of the day, that day being the 29th of May, 1453, and I was dedicating a chapter to the experiences of captivity and the likelihood that someone would be ransomed or not, depending on, their proximity to capital and connections. And this book came along at it was last minute, but in time for me to benefit from it. It is called Greek Captives and Mediterranean Slavery, 1260 to 1460, and it's actually available online as an ebook. I think it's free and accessible, so all of you can go download it. It is very, very clear, informative, and thorough, and it had some fascinating aspects of this kind of experience that I wasn't aware of. In particular, I was impressed by the way in which religion, or one's perceived religious affiliation, was a grounds for being retained as a captive or not, depending on the society. So this is a crucial difference between later forms of slavery that are based on race. We discussed this in our conversation. But also the kinds of institutions that developed around captivity and the efforts of family members in particular to ransom those they had lost. So while not a fun book in terms of its subject matter, but I found it intellectually very illuminating. And so was the conversation that I had with Alasdair. I'm passing on to you now. I will put a link to the book in the episode description if I can find it in time. And also, I want to thank medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Here's my conversation with Alasdair Grant. Alasdair, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Anthony. Thank you very much indeed for having me.
So your book dropped on my desk at the last possible useful moment. So I was finishing revisions to a new book that I've written on 1453 and the siege, and I've dedicated an entire chapter to the fate of the captives. And it's quite possible, I could be wrong, but it's quite possible that this is the single event that generated the most information about that topic from this broad period, late medieval period. And it was so fascinating to explore the Italian side of things, the Greek side of the Turkish side of things, because they all sort of come together in this one event that has these repercussions for in all kinds of places you wouldn't expect, even a banking crisis in Venice and so on. And I also sent the book immediately to Nancy Bisaha, who is writing her own kind of book on 1453. I hope to do a separate podcast on that. But of course, you take a broader approach to this is an entire period in a region, not just a particular event. Let's start at the beginning. What led you to study this topic? What did you see that was missing in the scholarship, or what drew you to it originally?
Yeah, this is a mixture of a little bit of serendipity, a little bit of personal interest. Um, I suppose, has roots quite a long time ago when I started studying as an undergraduate at St Andrews. And I got myself a copy of the Penguin Atlas of Medieval History in a secondhand bookshop. And I was flicking through at that point, was very interested in the early Middle Ages. But I noticed that as you got further and further towards the back of the Atlas, that things started to look more and more fragmented, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I found that fascinating. I wanted to know what it was that was going on in the 13th and 14th centuries that was leading to all these lines and dots on the map round about the Aegean. And then I started looking at what we had in the university library, and I discovered that a certain Stephen Runciman, known to some as a historian of the Crusades, to others as a Byzantinist, had actually left his library to the University of St Andrews. And I took a course on Byzantium and the Ottomans and started reading further and thought, wow, this is really a topic that I would like to stick with. And to begin with, I was interested in this question of lived religion, sort of realities, everyday realities of how religion worked between Greeks, Latins, and Turks in this world. But when I started my PhD, which was going to be on this question of interreligious interaction, my supervisor, Neil Scarl, said to me, this is far too broad. Why don't you start with something quite concrete? Maybe have a look at some manuscript letters I've found, which are to do with ransoming captives. And long story short, this ended up being the full thesis because it turned out that when you started to look for other examples and when you started to fill out this topic, it very quickly became, uh, yeah, a whole 2 volumes.
Yes, and those manuscript letters that you mentioned, they're actually a very interesting part of the book. I confess I did not know about those kinds of letters, and so I've added them to my history with a note to your book. We'll get to those later on. By the way, I had a similar experience with the same medieval atlas that you mentioned when I was, I think, an undergrad. And you know what I would do? If you flip through it quickly enough, you get this kind of like movie of the Roman Empire shrinking, slightly
Yeah, yeah.
expanding, then shrinking again over time, until it just kind of disappears into these little bubbles around the Aegean, around the 14th, 15th centuries. So exactly the same experience. So let's talk about the protagonists of your book. Are people who, in some contexts, are called Greeks, and in some texts, it would be called Romans. In what circumstances were they captured and enslaved in this period, and by whom?
Yeah, so you've already mentioned, and I think I've briefly alluded to some of the main actors. We've talked about this triangulation between Greeks, Turks, and Latins. Maybe just half a sentence on each of these words. I'm using the term Greeks here because a lot of these people are not living under the medieval Roman Empire, the Empire of Byzantium, and in my own understanding, the question of their self-identity is still a little bit ambiguous. And I wanted to choose a term that would make easy sense to people reading the book, which is why I use this term Greeks rather than Romans. The Latins, of course, we're talking about Venetians, Genoese, Catalans, people from Western Europe who arrived during the course of the Crusades in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then Turks. So, of course, the most famous of these later is the Ottomans, but there are other groups too in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. And basically, the historical starting point for this process, I suppose, is the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when you get the territorial breakdown of the Byzantine world conquered by Latin crusaders. And gradually things start to go wrong in Asia Minor too. The frontier between the Byzantine world and the Turkish world begins to break down, even though the Byzantine world becomes recentered on Constantinople and starts to expand a little bit in Europe. There's basically a pincer movement going on between Turkish raids and conquests in Asia Minor and in the 14th, 15th centuries, also in the Balkans. And then at sea, there is a commercial and territorial expansion by the Latin groups that I mentioned. And what you get is a sort of conjunction of these two things in these coastal cities in Western Asia Minor, where you have a combination between some people, mostly Turks, but also Latins, who are capturing Greek Christians, and then predominantly Latins who are exporting these people, trafficking them either into other parts of the Aegean or into the Western Mediterranean. And the Venetians are among the Latins, as far as I can tell, the main group that are involved in this. They have a lot of territorial and commercial interests in the Aegean, primarily in their main colony of Crete. Later, it's also Catalans, who are ironically originally called in to help the Byzantine Empire against Turkish expansion. But anyone who's familiar with this period has probably heard about the Genoese and the role that they play in the slave trade. And they actually play very little, a very small part in this trafficking of Greeks. And this may be partially because of their close relationship with the empire and their sense of diplomatic obligation. It may also be because they have quite a dominating, though never monopolizing role in the Black Sea slave trade. And so, in a sense, they have other supply routes, so to speak.
Yeah, so what are the exact circumstances under which people would be captured? I mean, are there like raiding parties that go off specifically for the purpose of rounding up some slaves and selling them? Are they casualties of war, like incidental, or soldiers who are defeated and captured? Like, what kinds of people are we talking about?
Yeah, so a short answer would be, I think, all three of these groups, although perhaps the first two most commonly. Um, there's a period long before the Ottoman conquests become embedded in the Balkans when there are periodic raids. These certainly have as one of their key goals capturing people as well as resources. There's also a lot of naval raiding. So whether we think this is piracy, in other words, naval raiding without any kind of, permission from an authority, or whether we think of this as corsairing, that's to say, naval raiding with the understanding and support of some kind of state. There are at any rate people in the Aegean who are capturing people both on land and at sea, and we see this recorded on both sides of the coin. So, for example, in the very small body of Turkish material, Turkish language material surviving from this period, or alluding to this period, there are mentions of these sorts of raids that clearly have as one of their aims capturing people. It's well known that Latins, so again, we're probably talking particularly about Venetians, carried out naval raids in the Aegean. So the small islands are particularly vulnerable and coastal communities. This is also something that's worth stressing, is that when you map where a lot of these people come from, and we know where a lot of these people come from because when they get sold in Western European ports or other areas that are dominated by kind of Latin Italian culture, there are documents drawn up that talk about them. And so they'll say things like they were captured from such and such a place, and we know where they were being sold. And so we can trace the journey that they took. And a lot of these people do come from the Aegean Islands or some of the coastal regions where they were probably particularly vulnerable. And islands with small populations, of course, are less able to defend themselves. But the slightly larger islands, I suppose, have more resources, perhaps are a bit more tempting. In terms of battles, yes, there is some evidence. I mean, if we look in the historiographical writings, this is perhaps something that we see far more often than we do in the smaller documentary texts that I'm talking about here, records of larger scale engagements where people are captured. But I get the impression that a lot of this is happening on quite a small scale. Small numbers of people being captured, sometimes opportunistically, but this takes place within the context of larger scale military engagements too.
So we'll talk in a moment about the distinction between captives and slaves and the ransoming of the captives, but let's stick with the slaves, or at least people whose condition is closer to something that most of our audience would understand as slavery, where you can be sold on a kind of slave market and end up very, very far from your home with no prospect really of being ransomed. So who's operating the slave trade in the Aegean in this period? In other words, let's say you're a raider and you've rounded up some people and you don't intend them to take them back home and set them to work in agricultural or whatever kind of labor. You just want to sell them off for profit. Where do you go?
There are several entrepôts in the Aegean where it seems that a lot of this trafficking is happening. This may be an accident of source survival as well. That's something that's always important to remember, is that there are some areas that are simply far better documented than others. But it seems that the focal point of all of this is Crete, and the city that in the Middle Ages is called Candia. So this is Heraklion. This is the capital of Crete, and this is where the Venetians, who rule Crete in the late medieval and indeed also early modern period, have their capital. And this is this is clearly a large slaving market. And in terms of the sort of profile of the people, I mean, of course, the actors are the people we've been discussing. It's the Venetians, it's the Catalans, it's the Turks, perhaps to a lesser extent, but again, that may be to do with documentation. Again, some of this seems to be small scale, individuals being trafficked. We're not talking about transatlantic style enormous shipments of enslaved people, but rather perhaps smaller shipments of people who are also dealing in other wares as well. So these are merchants who have a broader portfolio, and slavery is simply part and parcel and an everyday reality of the economy that they operate in. And sometimes you find small groups, maybe 5, 6 people, who might be bought or sold by the same individual. And certainly a place where they are being sent west in seemingly quite large numbers is the world run by the Catalans in Catalonia, Aragon, Majorca, also in Sicily, which for a while is under a royal family that comes out of the Aragonese world. And we can sort of trace this in terms also of the origins of people mentioned in documents from the Western Mediterranean. We can also see this in the identities of people recorded in Italian documents. There are people who are called Catalans or people who are said to be from places like Barcelona or Majorca who are then taking people west. So again, the usual sort of actors that we've been talking about, but it's important to think of this as a sort of more fragmented kind of slave trade than what we might be otherwise imagining.
I want to pick up on that last comment, what we might be imagining. And you mentioned earlier the transatlantic trade. And in discussions of slavery and enslavement in the pre-modern world, one will often run into the transatlantic slave trade treated as a kind of normative model that is, this is what people think of when we're thinking about a slave trade. And so everyone has to position their area of study vis-a-vis that. Is that something that you had to do? You felt you had to do it, or like what are the main differences that you feel you have to highlight between the phenomena that you're studying and the later transatlantic slave trade?
The transatlantic slave trade is absolutely seen as some kind of yardstick for the study of global slavery. I definitely think both from my own personal experience and from, for example, reading reviews of other scholars' books in the field of medieval slavery, it does seem that there is a lot of pressure to relativize all of our research in the context of transatlantic slavery, which is understandable because, of course, it's a system that has wide-reaching ramifications down to this day. And it's something that if we think about, well, what are the main characteristics of transatlantic slavery? It's a slavery that's based on racism based on the color of people's skin. And this is the kind of underpinning mentality that is used to justify it. It's a slave trade that dislocates people across enormous distances between the African continent and the American supercontinent. And it's also a type of slavery that's focused on agriculture. So when we think about this kind of slavery, what we think of is agricultural production. And of course, in terms of how we theorize the importance of slavery in global history, we do tend to focus on this question of economic production. And so this means that periods in which agricultural slavery is widespread tend to get more attention, I would argue, as societies in which slavery plays major roles. So this is why when you're not thinking about transatlantic slavery, the second context that one tends to think of is ancient Rome, or particularly Italy and Sicily, because it's actually doubtful to what extent the Roman Empire in antiquity at large relied upon agricultural slavery. But certainly, if we say with Italy and Sicily, there are these large estates. And of course, at school, we see these pictures on the wall with this with the feudal pyramid, and you see the king and the barons and the knights and the peasants. But who isn't there? Slaves are not there. There is no slave labor depicted on this pyramid. And to a large extent, of course, this is true. Agricultural slavery does occur in the medieval period, but extremely rarely, and largely it's replaced by peasant labor, sometimes free, sometimes unfree. This is also a matter of debate and scholarship. What is the status of the
Hmm.
peasantry in particular periods? Um, and very few of these factors hold true for the context of the medieval Mediterranean. So we talk about this large distance dislocation, this basis on racism and skin color, and this question of agricultural labor. And of course, we're talking about a slave trade where people probably actually have, if not personal contact, they at least are working within a world where they know these places very well from which they're capturing people. The traffickers and trafficked people are in a sort of constant world of exchange. Um, this is a world of domestic slavery. So these are people who are being used to undertake domestic service. Perhaps this is something we might come on to later, also some sort of artisanal labor, but they're not by and large agricultural slaves. In fact, they're overwhelmingly not agricultural slaves. Um, and of course, the other thing is that it's not based on racist stereotyping. So there is racism in medieval slavery. There are stereotypes. There are ways in which people talk about different ethnicities, different skin colors, different characteristics that one might associate with these people in a way that we would today identify as being racist thinking. But that's not the underlying justification for slavery, because the underlying justification, theoretically at least in the Middle Ages, is that these people belong to a different religious group from you, not that they belong to a different ethnic group. And of course, ethnicity plays a role, but it's not the case that people have to prove that they have a certain background or demonstrate or be visibly of a certain skin color in order to claim their freedom, for example. So these are major differences as well. And I mean, an interesting line of inquiry, not something for today, but something to think on, is the ways in which the experience of what I would be happy to describe as colonization in the Eastern Mediterranean by these Latin groups we've been talking about then becomes directly exported to the New World through
Hmm.
Spanish colonization in the early modern period, because even though there isn't a direct line between the plantation slavery of the American South or of Brazil and what is happening in the Mediterranean world, there are threads that join these two experiences.
Yes, I would second that. And sometimes even some of the same people
Absolutely.
in that transitional moment between, you know, the late 15th and the early 16th century, especially if you look at the careers of some of the Spaniards. But anyway, and you know, you're quite right, and you do an excellent job in the book, I have to say, of um, talking about how the legal status and, you know, slavery and freedom are linked to perceptions of religious belonging. And so very quickly, debates about slavery will sometimes become debates about what religion someone belongs to, because it's not always clear. And yeah, that just creates a very different context. So, I mean, I encourage the audience to read those sections. They're very fascinating. Especially when you're unsure, when authorities are unsure about how to classify a group in religious terms, because it has direct bearing on their legal rights in the country that they find themselves in. Anyway, the difference I wanted to get to is this distinction between captives and slaves. So, what is that? It might not be intuitive to most people, and are there ambiguous cases?
This is a problem that starts to confuse you as soon as you begin to look at the source material, because there's a wide array of terms that are used in different languages. So we're talking about Greek texts, Latin texts, Western European vernacular texts, Arabic texts, Turkish texts, and they have a bewildering array of terms
Mm.
for all different types of unfreedom. And part of this question is the perspective of that source material. So something, I mean, just to highlight one example alone, if we think just for a moment about Greek language sources, they describe the people who were enslaved within their own society with terms that mean slave, like sclavi or luli, but they refer to people from their own society who are being enslaved as echmalati, and that means captives. This is not referring to their status as a slave. And I think what this suggests is that they're far more interested in that moment of dislocation from their own society. So we're left with two exercises, I would say. The first exercise is basically one of lexicography. What do these terms in the documents, the texts that survive, mean in their given context? But the second one, which I think is perhaps even more important, is, well, how do we come up with some useful terms for describing what's going on? And it seems to me that in our vocabulary now, slavery and captivity or slave and captive do have notable differences, and that we should use them to describe separate things. And in the late medieval Aegean, something that's worth highlighting is that the vast majority of enslaved people seem to have become enslaved because of capture. So that means that they're not, for example, becoming enslaved, so selling them into slavery, something that sometimes occurs in the Black Sea area. Some people are being born into slavery, and there are some documents that suggest that some people, at least, are selling themselves into slavery because of reasons of indebtedness. But primarily, what we're talking about is a society where people become enslaved because they are captured. And it seems that people also have a reasonable chance of being freed at some point during their lifetime. This varies from place to place, but basically, we have a lot of documents freeing people, coming with the Latin term manumission, that demonstrate, I think, that a lot of these people are not in lifelong slavery. Some perhaps, but many people are freed. So most slaves in this period are captives, but not all captives became slaves. And this question of where we draw the line between these two statuses, there are some obvious things that we could pick up on. For example, if there's an act of sale. So, for example, there are some documents where we learn, I'm talking about notarial acts surviving in Italian archives, that a certain person has been captured in a raid, perhaps at sea, perhaps on land. And then that person has been sold into slavery. And that would have been a moment where that change of status would have been very, very clear. But of course, sometimes people maybe remain with their captors and there's simply a passing of time. There's no clear moment at which somebody changes status. It may be that the family of the captured person eventually simply fails to ransom, is unable to ransom that person, or they don't have a family. But another way that this could happen is that the person who was captured could be forced to make some kind of confession before a notary. And we've got an interesting example of this from the turn of the 15th century in Catalonia. A Greek man called Iorios, he actually petitioned the king himself directly, which was something that was possible in the Aragonese Catalonian realm, and said that he'd been held captive and chained up for 7 years by his captor, who was a Catalonian man. And the purpose of this was to try to get him to confess before a notary that he was a slave and that he was ethnically a Saracen. So that means that he was a Muslim. He wasn't a Greek. But he said, well, I'm a Greek and I'm also not somebody who was legally enslaved, and therefore I should be free. And if he had been compelled to make such a confession before a notary, it would have been then very, very difficult to deny that. So as long as he was able to restrain from making that confession, then it was much easier for him to claim that he had never legally entered the status of slavery. Now, just one last comment. If we stay with the sort of Catalan world, interestingly, unlike in Italy, where the language of slavery seems to be fairly clear cut, people who are mentioned in the documents who are slaves are referred to as slaves, as sclavi. In the Catalan world, the term captive is often used interchangeably with slave. And in contexts where it seems to me that in an Italian equivalent, the status would be fairly clearly regarded as slavery. So whether this means something in terms of this person's status or whether this is just differences of language usage across different groups, it's very difficult to tell. But there are certainly plenty of ambiguities in the language, but I think it's our responsibility as historians then to draw some kind of meaningful distinction and come up with some kind of definitions of what a captive is, what an enslaved person is, and how these two things can usefully be used to analyze our material.
I ran into this problem when I was studying the people I mentioned, the captives taken in 1453 after the siege. And it was apparent, or it quickly became apparent to me that some were going to be in that position for the long haul and were never ransomed. And after a certain point, you can treat them as enslaved. Whereas I think for the first few months after the fall of the city, it was probably safer to just refer to them as captives because for many, the possibility of being ransomed was there. And many of them were, but these are people who had connections and resources. And so there is there, I think there's definitely a class dynamic to who was ransomed and who was not.
Absolutely, yes.
And who was a temporary captive and who was and would become a slave. There's some weird cases, for example, the scholar Michail Apostolis, who ended up in Crete later on and wrote a lot of the manuscripts that classical studies, nobody knows him, but they use his manuscripts to, of classical authors for their editions. And he spent 37 days in a ship as rowing, right? I'm not sure exactly. He doesn't say, whose ship and who owns it, how he was ransomed, but he says he was captured or enslaved, in the fall and spent 37 days on the ship. And, being put to row in a ship is, that's pretty harsh. And it's something more like the experience of a slave than a high value prisoner whom you're waiting to ransom. Nevertheless, he was ransomed. And he went to Crete. So I was dealing with this kind of ambiguity. I think the majority of people, didn't have relatives or wealthy sponsors in Italian cities to ransom them, and they were just dispersed to wherever their captors wanted to use them. Anyway, well, let's talk a little bit about um, the occupations that they were, or labor that they were made to, or forced to perform, or expected to perform. So what is the labor fate of most of the captives and slaves that you studied? You said it wasn't primarily agricultural. I suppose it could be. Well, what other sorts of things do they do?
Some of this has to be inferred by proxy in terms of what the people who captured them or owned them did. Um, as I mentioned, it does seem to be overwhelmingly the case that these people are not agricultural slaves. You mentioned the question of galley slavery. This is also something that in the period before the 15th century, the 16th century, crops up far less. And it's not something that I found in any of the examples that I was looking at. And indeed, something that's a bit of a puzzle is what happens to these people who are in these limbo periods.
Mm,
Because I remember
limbo.
once reading an article about Frankish captives in Cairo, and it discusses the sort of building works, etc., sort of manual labor that they were expected to do while they were being held there. And I was reading some of these documents that refer to complaints against the Byzantine emperor for acts of piracy or corsairing committed against subjects of Venice. And in there's a mention of somebody who seems to be used to dig ditches. But this is exactly the sort of evidence that I've never found for the other side, in the sense that when you read these documents about Greek-speaking people, Christian people who are captured in this context, we have very, very little clarity on what they're doing. We have one document that says that this family was in the household of so and so, and maybe we can extrapolate from this that they were undertaking domestic service. But the point is that until the moment at which they are clearly enslaved rather than simply in a period of captivity or house arrest, we have very little clarity. But once we get to that point, we do have more information. And so, for example, if we look at Majorca, which at this time is a society with in terms of a percentage of the population, a remarkably high number of enslaved people for Mediterranean terms. We can see in whose households these enslaved people are living. There are documents to do with taxation, for example, of households that list who's living there, and we find enslaved people serving bakers, drapers, cloth dyers, merchants, notaries, pharmacists, etc. So we're talking about a sort of urban middle class, basically. And we don't really know if they're doing this work a lot of the time, but it might be fair to assume that they're involved in more than just,
Yeah.
let's say, household labor, that they're also involved in sort of cottage industry labor. Something that they do that allows them to earn some money in order potentially to pay off their freedom is taking bread to municipal ovens. So of course, bread ovens have to reach very high temperatures in order to cook bread effectively. And a lot of people either can't afford to do this at home or it's simply not safe. And so you have these municipal ovens, which is a sort of whole institution in this world. And of course, if you imagine it's the middle of summer in Mallorca, you're taking bread to an oven that's, I don't know, 250, 300 degrees Celsius. It's probably not particularly nice work. And so this is something that is delegated to enslaved people. But this is something they can earn a bit of cash for. In Turkish Asia Minor, it seems to be a sort of similar picture insofar as enslaved people are seemingly doing domestic work. We also find them at the courts of these Turkish princes in this period. So, of course, this is a period where in the 13th, 14th centuries, we're not yet talking about the Ottoman world of the early modern period. We're talking about a world of a large number of Turkish groups, each with their own princely families and small courts, perhaps in these urban centers. And this seems to be the picture there. There's the question as well about military slavery. Anyone who's familiar with the Islamic world in the Middle Ages will probably be listening out for mentions of military slavery, which is something that already begins in the early Islamic period, in I suppose the 9th, 10th centuries, possibly even earlier. And this is most famously seen in the case of the what we call the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria. So this is in the late Middle Ages, and it's named after the Mamluks, who are enslaved Turkish or Caucasian, normally, soldiers who are then freed. And then they serve in the army, and they come to be the ruling class of this polity. But the interesting thing is that despite the fact that there are some literary texts that claim that people are coming from the Byzantine world, that there are people who are taxonomized as Greeks, who are called Rumi or whatever, or who in Latin sources are being referred to in Greeks as Greeks, that these people are here. There are claims that they are involved in the Mamluk system. There's also a martyrology, a saint's life that talks about somebody who was supposedly in the Mamluk system, supposedly a military slave in Egypt. There's actually very, very little documentary evidence. In fact, I would go as far as to say I have found no documentary evidence to back up this idea that Greeks were being trafficked to Egypt and Syria. So this remains a bit of a mystery. The last comment to make, of course, is about sexual slavery. This is something that's not often discussed. This may be somewhat to do with prudishness of historians, but I think it's probably even more to do with the fact that this is often almost invisible in the source material that we have. But we should assume that women in particular are routinely subject to sexual assault by their masters, that they're obliged to provide sexual services. And of course, when we think about what men are perhaps being obliged to do, we know nothing. Basically, as far as I can tell, we know nothing at all. This is simply not something that's being discussed. But of course, some of these enslaved women are bearing their masters' children. And something that's a very interesting development of the Italian world in the later Middle Ages is a change of law. So under Roman law, you would inherit the status of your mother, which means that if your mother is enslaved, if you were born to that woman, you would also be born enslaved. But the law has changed so that these children can inherit the status of their father. So if we imagine a society like Crete or the other areas in the Aegean where you have essentially a Latin colonial society with a lot of men away from their home communities, having habitual relationships with enslaved women of other cultures, religions, native languages. These people have to reproduce both biologically and dynastically. They have to have legal heirs who can inherit their property upon their death. And this is achieved by legitimizing these children. So reproduction, sexual slavery, these are also things that are vital to the central to the experience of enslaved people in this period, however much or however little we might normally discuss these things.
Yeah, I was looking for sexual exploitation when it came to the fate of the captives of Constantinople, and you're exactly right. I think the sources are also rather reticent about this. And the closest that I came is to Georgios Franzis, who was the
Yeah,
Constantine
yeah.
the Eleventh's, confidant and advisor. And he and his entire family were captured and enslaved, and he was ransomed. But he notes in his memoirs that his wife and daughters remained in captivity, and that their owner made a good profit from their good looks. And I was like, well, what else can he be referring to here? I mean, it's an elusive way of pointing out a terrible family situation, but he does do it anyway. Um, and I'm not sure that she was ever released. Okay, so we've talked about the possibility of being ransomed in here and there. Why don't you tell us about these documents that you found? The letters, I think, that got you started off on all of this, the Echmalotika. I found these a fascinating kind of text or formula. Can you tell us what these are?
Right. These are, yeah, as you say, I think really fascinating documents that have, to a very small extent, been studied insofar as some of them have actually been edited. And the curious thing is that a couple of these examples have been available to historians for decades and decades, but they don't really seem to have attracted any attention. And perhaps this is because you have to put quite a lot of the puzzle pieces together before you
Right.
start to realize what the significance of these letters are. Um, I mentioned that slavery in this period is quite fragmented in the sense that the numbers of people who are being enslaved, although we don't know, I haven't been able to estimate what sort of totals we're talking about. Individual shipments are often quite small, and this is a world in which politics is very fragmented. And this is mirrored in the fact that ransoming also seems to happen on quite a sort of fragmented individual basis. You mentioned earlier that there's probably a class dynamic in terms of paying for ransom. Of course, if you're really prominent, then your ransom price can simply be put up to something astronomical that you can't pay. But sure, I think, yeah, basically we have other evidence, for example, from the First Ottoman conquest of Thessaloniki, that this is exactly what's happening. People who are a bit wealthier are basically able to call in the ransom money very quickly, but poorer people are not. So what do you do if you don't have the money to ransom yourself? And especially, what do you do if you don't have recourse to any kind of state bureaucracy that can help you with this? And of course, a lot of these people still have recourse to an institutional church. So these people who are living outside the political boundaries of the shrinking Byzantine Empire, whether in Asia Minor, in the Latin ruled territories, in the Aegean, on the island of Cyprus, for example, they have access to an institutional church which has literate people who can help them to write up what's happened to them and to help them seek assistance. So an ekmalotikon is literally a letter that pertains to a captive, and it is a short text normally where either a bishop, an archbishop, or even on one occasion, seemingly the patriarch, or presumably some sort of scribe attached to the bureau of the patriarch, issues a document that says this person was captured, sometimes in circumstances that are described. There may be a mention of how much the ransom cost was set at. And then there would be some citations from the Bible explaining why giving charity was such a virtuous act and why helping captives is something that is particularly virtuous among the various things that you can do in terms of donating money. And it's essentially a testimonial. It attests to your good faith. It basically says this is a real thing that happened to this person. I believe this. I'm a figure of authority who is going to write a document that says that this is something that happened. And then the person who had undergone captivity or a family member would then carry this letter around Christian communities. Presumably, well, we know that at least in one example in Crete, one of these letters seems to have been turned into a sermon. So it seems plausible that some of these were read out in church in some form or another, because of course we have to reckon with a world where a lot of these people who were being asked for money possibly couldn't read themselves, or it was being handed to clergy, and then people were being asked to donate money. So this obviously paints a picture of captives as being remarkably mobile. We might imagine people languishing under arrest, a house arrest somewhere, or being in some sort of imprisonment situation, or we might imagine people undertaking the sort of labor that we've been discussing. And instead, these ethnologica seem to suggest people who are actually able to move very large distances across the Mediterranean world in search of financial help. And sometimes these are probably people who were able to put down some kind of advance payment and free themselves. Sometimes a family member would remain in captivity as insurance.
Yeah.
So as a kind of, yeah, exactly as a hostage to guarantee that the rest of the ransom payment would be made. And in general, this is something that is happening, yeah, on a very individualistic basis rather than on a sort of institutional basis. But it is somewhat institutionalized because we have about a dozen, or I have been able to find, I should say, about a dozen of these letters, but none of them survives as an original. So it's not a loose leaf. And there are some loose leaf letters from this period. So it's not something that would be completely unimaginable, but it's something that gets copied up, often at the back of manuscripts or as part of collections of letters that are to be used as templates. Sometimes not catalogued very well in manuscripts, which also makes them slightly challenging to find. And in the process of copying, as was common with these sort of everyday texts, as well as also with literary texts in the Byzantine world, a lot of the personal details were excised. So obviously this is deeply frustrating for historians because it means that sometimes you'll be told they were held to ransom for the amount of, and then of course you don't actually know what the amount of, or they came from such and such a place, or their name was such and such, or there was an attack on this area, this city that was called blank. And so this is deeply frustrating in terms of what we can reconstruct from these letters. But what it suggests is that these letters are being copied down as templates because there is a perception that they may need to be used as a reference point to issue new examples. And because there are a couple of them that seem to have a relationship, a textual relationship to each other, but on the whole, they're disparate examples, which suggests, of course, that there's a sort of textual tradition that is completely invisible to us now, in terms of how these documents are being copied and then reused. I should say that the title that I'm using, Ichmaloticon, there are actually only a couple of examples that use this rubric in the manuscript. Sometimes they're not titled, sometimes they're called about a captive or a letter for such and such for a captive. So this is a term that I've taken as one of convenience to refer to the whole genre.
That's fair enough.
And the last thing to mention, if you go into the early modern period, you get examples that look very much like this. Often just general arms raising documents, so not necessarily for cases of captivity, but this is a genre that really continues right up into the, well, as far as I'm aware, at least into the 18th century, and who knows, maybe beyond. And so this is something that when we think about sort of constructing the corpus of these documents, there is a very closely associated corpus that stretches for centuries and centuries after the fall of Constantinople.
When I read your analysis of these documents, I immediately thought of Isidore or Isidoros, the cardinal. So it's an ethnic Greek who becomes a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church, and he's in Constantinople during the siege. He's actually one of the most important people there. He is captured. He's not recognized by his captors, at least. He's quickly ransomed. What I think happened is that he was recognized by people who had money, and especially the Genoese. He's a cardinal of their church, so they ransom him, probably very cheaply. But he's on a very, very short list of people that the Sultan wants to get his hands on. So he goes into hiding and he eventually escapes and he gets to Crete. But in order to get there, for a while, he's pretending that he's a father who's going around begging for money to ransom his child, I think. And I knew this story. I immediately thought, okay, so this is a world where there are a lot of grifters going around begging for money on that, premise. And
It
so,
seems so, yeah.
yeah, no, I like it. This is a world that's set up for that kind of scam. And, just like in earlier centuries, you have people who are pretending to be possessed. Anyway, and when I read your analysis, I thought, oh, this is how institutions try to safeguard the integrity of the ransoming or the collection process. So, he probably had one of these documents to confer authenticity on what he was doing, even though he actually wasn't doing that. He was just trying
Yeah.
to escape. He wasn't trying to, gather money. It was a scam of a whole different kind. How do you sneak a Catholic cardinal out of the camps of the Sultan? Anyway, so that's where I thought that was really fascinating. Um, so let's look at the sort of missing part of the picture here, which is that for part of the period that you cover, the Romans actually have their own state. What could it do for them if they were captured, or did it do anything, or could it prevent them from being captured in some way? Did it take on responsibilities toward its subjects in this area?
Yeah, well, a lot of people familiar with this period will have heard about this debate that I think it's safe to say is still ongoing about the question to what extent the church took on the responsibilities of the state in the late period. Um, to some extent, I don't want to enter into this debate for the empire itself because I'm not sure what my opinion is, but certainly for the areas outside the empire, there is no question that they do this. Um, in terms of what the state itself is doing, the first thing to mention probably is that they're not organizing large scale exchanges. And I mention this because this is something that people who are familiar with an earlier period might be expecting to hear. Um, if people know something about captivity in the Byzantine world, it is often about this sort of border raiding in the Abbasid period in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. And what they know about is that on the border between the Abbasid Empire and the Byzantine Empire, there were formalized, ritualized exchanges of captives organized by the two states, which clearly show a kind of gesture of mutual understanding that these are two empires that are operating at the same kind of level, let's say. So they're diplomatic equals. And this doesn't happen in the late period. There is a very interesting letter which arrives from the Mamluk Sultan, arguing that this is what should be happening, probably on the basis of institutional knowledge. But basically, as I was saying, this is something that's much more fragmented in this period. The empire is capable of exerting diplomatic pressure. So, for example, they put pressure on the Genoese who are living in Pera, their commercial colony just opposite Constantinople. And they say, okay, to maintain your privileged position here right at the center of the empire, you're absolutely not allowed to traffic our children to Genoa. And they seem to hold to this. And there's also, for example, from the very late period, from the 15th century, evidence for the emperor treating with the King of Naples, who apparently had subjects who were Catalans. In fact, this is of course still this world of the sort of Catalan maritime presence in the Mediterranean, and that their subjects were committing piracy in the Aegean. So there are instances where emperors basically intervene diplomatically, but something that I was very surprised to find existed, even more surprised to find that there is documentary evidence for this institution in practice, is that there was a consul of the Romans in Genoa. And indeed, Romans is the term in this context. I believe actually both terms are used in these documents. You find both Greeks and Romans, but this is an individual who's actually a Latin, who helps, let's say, Greek-speaking Christians, regardless of their subjecthood. And this is somebody who appears to be operating under the aegis of the Byzantine state in much the way that the Latin officials are in their commercial colonies in the Byzantine world. So you have people who carry the title of, for example, podesta, the power holder, who are active in the Aegean, who seem to be doing sort of similar things, or also people who have this kind of position of consul, such as the Catalans have. But I think the most important factor of all is that the Byzantine state basically holds the cards in terms of this question of church union. And to explain a little bit of backdrop about that, I said earlier on that the kind of key justification for slavery in the medieval Mediterranean is religious difference, religious alterity. And one of the big debates of this period is to what extent are we talking about two churches in terms of the Church of Rome and Constantinople? To what extent are we talking about one temporarily estranged church? So two temporarily estranged limbs of the same body. And there are multiple attempts to try to bring these two back into conversation with each other. This is a split that begins centuries earlier, but gradually becomes ingrained in cultural differences across the Mediterranean world. And although there are a lot of Christians who are in communion with Constantinople, who are not living under the power of the Byzantine Empire, for example, in Georgia, in the Black Sea region, under the Latins, I very much interpret this as a sort of political project of the Byzantine Empire. The question of church union is the thing that you hold in front of the Latins in order to try to stop them from attacking you, or in order to try to garner better treatment. And perhaps the most famous example of one of these unions is right at the end of the period of the existence of the Byzantine state in 1439, when the reunification of the two churches is proclaimed in Florence at a church council. And there are some documents from Majorca which suggest that people in the Western Mediterranean were saying, okay, now that we've got official recognition of the reunification of the two limbs of the church, you have to accept that these people do belong to the same church as you, and therefore you have to free them. But of course, there's resistance to this. People don't accept that because they say, well, no, because slavery is a legal institution. These people are legally enslaved. And so there's also this tension between the kind of the legal, the social elements, and then this political, religious element. But fundamentally, I do think this question of ecclesiastical relations is one of the things of real consequence that the Byzantine state is basically capable of holding in front of the Latins.
Yeah, I mentioned that part of your discussion earlier, which got me thinking, because we treat the question of church union or schism often in a very abstract way, from like theological, ecclesiological kinds of definitions. And what I liked about your discussion was that it brought it down to some very practical decisions that sometimes courts had to make as to whether we recognize people of that church as being, the same as ours or not. And it's like we said, this where the rubber meets the road. Like, did you accept the union or not? It has like serious practical implications for people's lives. Anyway, Alasdair, there's lots more that we can talk about here. I think we're out of time, but I definitely would encourage our audience to read the book. It's very accessible for all that. You've got Venetians and Genoese and Greeks and Turks, and you're juggling them all. But it was a pretty good read, actually. So well done. And
thank you very much. I would like to put in there that it's also free. So you can simply go and download it, open access. So you don't need to pay whatever's being asked for it now.
Good point. I will put a link to the book in the episode description. Good. And I also look forward to your next project. We were talking about it briefly earlier on demography. So when that comes to fruition, or you want to talk about it, drop me a line and we'll set that up.
Yeah, it would be a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming on. Take care.
Thank you, Anthony.